Hey everyone, it's Brian here. Today's video is part of a series in which we'll tackle common coding questions that FAANG companies ask you during your technical interview screens. These questions often trip up new grads and new engineers, yet they're essential to acing the FAANG interview process and scoring that dream job. In this series, I'll walk you through how to fully tackle each of these coding challenges. We'll analyze the problem together, walk through it with step-by-step explanations, and present an optimum solution that the interviewer expects at the end of your session. Without further ado, let's dive right into the problem. Alright, so the problem that we're looking at today is valid palindrome, which is super common for new grads or intern level engineering technical challenges. You might be provided this in a format different than Leetcode, such as HackerRank, or even a Google Doc if you are taking a Google interview. However, it should be the same content. For our format, we're given a description with 2 examples and the code on the right side of the screen. After the interviewer presents you the problem, you can always ask to take a minute or 2 to read over and think about the problem. Note that you should express this to the interviewer and not just sit in silence as you read the problem. So our description is pretty short for this problem. Given a string S, determine if it's a palindrome and consider only alphanumeric characters and ignoring cases. Now this hints us towards something already. We want to only consider alphanumeric characters, which means our input may be in the form of symbols, numbers, white spaces, things that we don't want to consider in our palindromes problem. This is unique to our problem, as there may be cases where we consider a colon, for example, not actually being part of a palindrome and thus returning false. But for this specific problem, we do want to allow that and consider these as a palindrome anyway. So in our first example, we see this to be true with a man, a plan, a canal, colon, Panama. We're going to drop all of these spaces between the words in our parsing. We're going to remove the commas, or ignore the commas, and we're going to ignore the colon. And we can see that the question considers this to be true. Once you drop all of those non-alphanumeric characters, we do indeed have a palindrome. Our second example is just a simple false case, which shows that race a car is not a palindrome because the E and the A don't quite match up. The constraints that we're given today are nothing too notable, just that S consists of only printable ASCII characters, so we're not going to get anything too bizarre in the input that could potentially break our code. So now, after taking a minute or 2 to read over the problem, this is where in the interview you would start describing to your interviewer different approaches you might be considering to tackle the problem. Ideally, you would start seeing that we need to iterate over our string of input that we're given, but we can do this in different ways. The first naive solution that might come to mind is we'll just start from the first character A and iterate all the way through to the end of the string. However, this doesn't really help us solve the issue of a palindrome, because a palindrome is the same when you split it down the middle and mirror it on either side. Thus, we might start to consider a 2-pronged approach in which we start from A at the start and the A at the end of Panama and meet towards the middle in this problem. At this point, you should be narrating all of these thoughts to your interviewer, and they might point you in a direction that you can do this without using 2 loops. For example, you can do this all using actually 1 loop. And this is where the palindrome problem starts to shine for the interviewer. At this step, this will distinguish a stronger engineer versus a weaker engineer who uses a less efficient 2-loop solution. Alternatively, you might know how to do this as a Python 1 or 2-liner, but that's not the point of this video. We're going to go through a very clean and understandable solution line by line. So let's start considering how to do this 2-pronged approach through 1 loop. Well, we know that if we're going to iterate forwards and backwards, maybe we shouldn't use a for loop, but instead let's consider a while loop since we have more flexibility. We can say while I is less than something. Well, in this case, we're limited to the length of the problem, being your input string. So we should have I being maybe the start of the input, and let's consider j the end of the input, the total length of the string. We'll write that out here, and we need to define what I and j are first. So we have I, j can be equal to, 0 as the start, and then j being the end of the string would have to be the length of the string minus 1 to make the pointers match up in Python. And know what I said pointers. Pointers is kind of the solution to this problem in an elegant way. We're going to have a pointer that starts at the beginning of the string and a pointer that is at the end of the string, and we'll increment the start pointer forward and the end pointer backward until they meet in the middle, and if they match, then we have a palindrome. And while it's easy to say, we need to get this in the code for our interviewer to believe us, so let's go ahead and start doing that. So far what we have here is I starts at 0, and j is the last character in our string. We know that we need to increment forwards and backwards, ignoring spaces, commas, colons, whatever isn't alphanumeric. Luckily for us, Python makes it super easy with an alphanumeric function that we'll want to try to remember as we go through these interviews. Some interviewers may allow you to look up syntax and code for Python, but generally because Python is such a simple language, they'll be expecting that you know it a little bit within your head. So to access some value in our string, we'll have to index it, right, with string I or string j. And we would do that by doing this close bracket notation here, and then we'll start processing off of that. So we can say that if our character is alphanumeric, which is designated by is al num alphanumeric, then we'll do something to it. And we'll need to make this an if statement. So if something is not an alphanumeric, then why don't we just skip it? Likewise, for j going backwards, if that is also not alphanumeric, then j will decrement. And we can do that by using a minus equals operator in Python instead of the traditional plus equals. Note that if you are interviewing in Python, which I highly suggest for FAANG companies, if you do I equals I plus 1 in this case, or I equals minus 1, this is a sign that you're a little less fluent and a little less comfortable with the environment, and you might actually get dog points for that due to style. Likewise, ways that you might be dog points is not knowing how to check alphanumeric, or if something is just alpha or is a number in your language of choice. And also, if you write a solution that doesn't contain a not, whether it's by a not exclamation point or a not written like this as in Python, this is a more elegant way to skip over the non-alphanumeric parts. It might be what they're looking for. All right, so now that we have this in place, we can start considering some other edge cases. We see that A is capitalized and Panama is capitalized, which in most languages, those are actually not the same as a capital and lowercase a. Those would return two different characters. So we want to make sure that we consider that edge case, that everything that is alphanumeric is being considered as lowercase. To do that, we'll do something similar to where we grab the character with si and sj, and we'll use the Python lowercase function, which is super convenient, and most languages have a way to convert uppercase and lowercase built in. Thus, this edge case will check for case sensitivity. So if si.lower is not equal to sj.lower, then these are actual character strings, and therefore we don't have a palindrome, because we would be checking if case sensitivity doesn't matter, a is equal to a is equal to b, then we error out, right? So we will just simply return false here. Now that leaves us with the case that we actually have found a palindrome. Now we can't just return true immediately, because that would just exit out the whole while loop. So instead, if something is fine, then we're fine with it, right? We can just skip on and continue checking on to see if something doesn't match. So in our example race car, our R's would match, our A's would match, our C's would match, and then EA's where we fail, and E would be not equal to A, and thus line 10 would execute, thus returning false, and it's not a palindrome. So how do we express this? Well, if we don't actually have to do anything, then let's just iterate I and j. So in this case, we'll say that I plus equals 1 and j minus equals 1. But there's a cleaner way to do this, and this also might be something that FAANG companies are looking for, because they expect a high level of polish and sophistication within your code, even though something like this might actually work. Instead, let's do simultaneous assignment, which is something that we can do in Python. We'll do I, comma, j equals the first part being what I corresponds to, and the second part being what j corresponds to, similar to how we did on line 3. So now we have that I will be incremented by 1, and j will be decremented by 1. And we can see now in our loop that we're properly checking for alphanumeric cases, we're checking for case sensitivity comparisons, and we're iterating in our loop so we won't get stuck in an infinite loop. All that leaves us with is, well then how do we return true for palindrome? Well, it's nice and easy in this type of problem because we're going to meet in the middle and the problem should exit anyway. So once we've exited, that means that we haven't found anything that would make it not be a palindrome, so we can simply return true. Note that you probably don't have to express this to your interviewer in this level of depth, but they do want you to walk through some of your thoughts, especially after you finish writing a line, explaining to them how your code works and what it does in the bigger part of the problem. All right, so now with it done, they might present you with a way to run your code, or they might just accept it as they know that it is true. Google is especially known for doing this, as they might just give you a Google Doc that even doesn't have syntax highlighting like this, so you might want to get familiar with that format. Well, now that we're done the problem, what's left? The interviewer might prompt you to explain space and time complexity, and that's something that you probably should do even unprompted. Simply put, time complexity is the amount of time that it takes a computer to run an algorithm, and you can view it generally commonly in something like a while loop. A while loop can be viewed as creating frames in a problem, thus steps for the CPU to execute through, which thus increases the time that it takes for a problem to run. Meanwhile, space complexity is just the amount of memory that gets used. So in this case, we're not assigning very many variables. Our variables are not arrays, so they're not growing in size. If we have a variable that's an array that can grow indefinitely in size, then that starts involving memory complexity, which is essentially space complexity. And that's when we would have to worry about it. But in this problem, we don't, because we're not creating anything new that could occur like that. Thus, for this palindrome problem, when our interviewer asks us what is the complexity of the problem or what is the runtime of the problem, we can go through line by line and say that on line 3, we're just doing a simple constant assignments, so we're still at O of 1. On line 4, we have a while loop, which proceeds through literal operations, so that may be considered O of n, which is linear runtime. Nothing else in the problem really stands out, thus we total up our runtime and we get O of n as the final result for this problem. Because we haven't assigned anything to memory, such as there are no arrays being initialized, our memory complexity is simply O of 1, which is constant. Your interviewer may ask you, can you do better than this? And you can say for the solution and the elegance of it, no, this is the most optimum runtime in space-time. And as an interviewer myself, if you deliver me a O of n solution with a constant space complexity on your first try, I'm impressed. Recall earlier I said that you could approach this problem using 2 for loops. Depending on how you use those 2 for loops, you could actually end up with a pretty bad runtime being n squared, because your first for loop and second for loop would be nested to reach the middle. Thus, that's why I steered away from that early on in the problem, so we don't waste our time with an unelegant solution, because the interviewer may dock you enough points, or you might actually run out of time during the interview before you get to a solution such as this one. Anyway, with this question done now, this was a Leetcode easy question, so if you have a 1-hour technical interview, you may be given 2 or 3 of these actually. If this is an intern level position and this is your first technical screen, this may be the only question that the interviewer gives you. At this point, the interviewer would conclude with maybe 5 to 10 minutes of chatting about the company, chatting about the role, and other soft skills that they can gauge you on. All right, now that we've finished the problem, I hope this video was helpful to you, and thank you so much for watching. Please give a like if it was helpful and helped you out, and I believe that all this content should be free and not behind some course or a paywall like some other channels. My goal is to grow this channel providing free content for aspiring engineers to use in pursuing their dream careers. And if you do believe in this mission with me too, please consider dropping a subscribe. It will definitely help my channel grow and keep me motivated to keep producing more content. With that said, thank you so much and have a good one.